All right, everyone. We are at 8 a.m. So I'm going to go ahead and get started with today's presentation. Thank you so much for being on here today. We're looking forward to covering some pretty hot topics that need to be discussed by the business leaders that we have in this meeting. My name is Caleb Knight. I'm the Director of Business Attraction for the Knoxville Chamber. We're excited to have you here to discuss the current trends in our housing market and how the affordability and availability of housing in our region is impacting economic growth. Today, you will hear the annual housing report from Hancen Sale, Government Affairs and Policy Director of the Knoxville Area Association of Realtors, followed by a panel discussion. If you have any questions during the presentation, please enter them in the chat box, and we will enter those at the end. And I'd also ask if everybody could go ahead and mute themselves to just prevent any sort of background noise during the discussion. I'm sure there will be some time to verbalize some questions at the end if the chat box is not sufficient. But without further ado, I will turn it over to Hancen. Hancen, thank you so much for being here today. Go ahead and take it away.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me, and I'm excited to talk a little bit more about the housing market. So just before we get started, and I'll go ahead and move to the next slide, this presentation is really just to give you a broad overview of what the market looked like in 2020 and sort of place it into historical context and provide some underlying information. And so I'll go ahead and start diving in. So just a broad overview. There were record high home sales in 2020, and that helped reach record low inventory in 2020. And so that's partially due to a pretty substantial supply demand imbalance. We saw very elevated demand, historically low mortgage rates, and household savings were part of that. The record low housing supply was really a legacy of the financial crisis in 2008. But the good news here is that the market fundamentals are really strong. There's not a lot of reason to think that the housing market is in a bubble or something of that nature. But we are likely nearing a peak in terms of just how fast demand and prices can grow. And so that's a sort of executive summary for you. This is some stats from this last year. You see inventory dropped almost half in 2020. Home sales were up pretty significantly. We saw double-digit gains in the median sale price, and new listings were down year over year and continue to be down so far in 2021. And one really neat part of that is Knoxville was rated number 32 on Realtor.com's list of top housing markets, forecasting 7.9% sales growth and 5.6% price growth. So, and that's among all metro areas in the United States. So that's a really big honor for Knoxville and really indicative of how strong our housing market has been. So this graph here is just going to show you monthly home sales over the last couple of years. As you can see, the green line is 2020. You can see early on in the pandemic in March, April, May, we saw a fairly significant drop in home sales. And then the latter half of the year, you see we were breaking records almost every month from June on. And you can see here in the blue that we are seeing record high home sales so far in 2021, despite there being the lowest inventory that we've ever seen in the period for which we have data. Though I will note, we are starting to see the constraints of the supply on home sales. So once this data is seasonally adjusted, which it is not in this graph, you're starting to see home sales decline, and that's really not indicative of a weak housing market or weak demand. It's just there are not enough homes available to be sold. And so we are, because we don't have the supply, missing out on a lot of gains we could have otherwise. So to explain a bit more about the demand here, historically low mortgage rates, you can see that Really for the period of which we have data going back all the way to 1970, mortgage rates are at a historic low. You zoom in here, the National Association of Realtors did predict for mortgage rates to elevate later on in the year, but we saw those rise a bit in March, but they've since fallen back down. And they're projected to hover around 3%, which is still very low in historical terms. Another piece to the demand is the impact of the pandemic itself. So what you see here is just change in employment by wage quartile. And this is just trying to show you that the pandemic really didn't impact the home buying community. The employment loss was heavily concentrated among low wage workers. And really, quite frankly, people who were not really going to be potential home buyers in the near future. And there was not a lot of loss in employment amongst in the higher wage quartiles of potential home buyers and current home buyers. And so, those people who didn't see losses in employment actually saw in higher personal income, whether it be from the federal stimulus measures. A lot of people were staying home, not going out to eat as much, deferring vacations. So you can see a lot of people were upgrading, and that sort of helps explain why demand was so elevated here in 2020, in a pandemic year and in a recession unlike any other recession that we've seen in the last few decades. On the supply side, this is just to show you that really the housing supply, this is not a new problem. This goes back all the way to 2008, which really decimated the housing industry as well as the home building community. But what you can see here is that this decline in inventory is becoming more and more acute, and it's getting worse faster. So you can see from really 2018 on, it's almost the slope is almost just straight down. We're not seeing as much of the seasonal fluctuation in the housing supply. And so that is showing us that demand is staying high while inventory is not recovering. And it does date back to all the way to 2008. And what you can see so far in 2021 is not all that encouraging on the supply side of things. So new listings are down 7.8% year over year. And again, this is a trend that has been going on for a number of years, but you can see there's been a fairly significant drop. And part of that is, yes, the prices are high right now and you can really get a lot of value out of your home, but you have to have a place to go if you want to put your house on the market, especially if you're not moving to the area and you're an existing homeowner just wanting to upgrade. There's not a lot of inventory available for you to choose from. And so we are seeing that people are not putting their homes on the market. Which is, another reason why new construction is so important here, because new construction is what will, in the long term, help alleviate any supply constraints. And going back to this supply-demand imbalance, that has spurred some pretty significant price growth in the Knoxville area. The 5-year price, 46% from 2015 to the end of 2020. So on average, the median sold price rose almost 50%, which is incredibly significant and really outpaces most places around the country. We're working from a lower base than a lot of larger metro areas, but we are growing faster than many metro areas. And so this is just going to show you a comparison of affordability in Knoxville, Nashville, and Chattanooga. And so you can see here in the orange line, Knoxville is much more affordable than Nashville is still to this day. We're a bit more or a bit less affordable than Chattanooga. But when you dive into these numbers, what you can see is that prices, and this is a new trend in 2020, and it's sort of indicative of what a great place to live Knoxville is, and how the pandemic has impacted us specifically. But really from May on, prices have grown faster in Knoxville than they have in Nashville or Chattanooga. So we're seeing price growth at a rate that's just much faster than really, uh, definitely than the national average, and really outpacing a lot of other, emerging housing markets around the country. So because we don't have the supply here, it's likely that we're going to continue to see some pretty strong price growth. And, it's important to know that this is a salient issue for Knox County voters, Knox County residents. Unfortunately, we didn't get to broaden this survey to beyond Knox County, but we just did this, and this is real-time data. So from March 21st to 23rd, we fielded a poll related to housing concerns. And more than 1 in 3 registered voters in Knox County said that housing affordability was a very or fairly big problem. And 1 in 4 said the same about the availability of housing. And so, I think this is a really important data point, because it shows us that this is a salient issue. People are feeling the effects of the supply shortage here, as well as, the booming job growth and employment growth with it, which is great, but we need to be able to house our workforce. And we want to be able to have workforce housing for that's affordable at various levels. And so this is a great data point just to show that people really are responding to what is going on in the market. This is just going to give you a little bit of background and insight. So 2008 really decimated the residential housing industry, from realtors to home builders, across the board. But the good thing is that home building is coming back, and we have just now, recovered to pre-2008 levels. And, there's been some trends here that have, I think probably kept home builders from building as many homes as they could, despite, they're ramping up production. But there are some limiting factors there. And, we are making up for a decade of underproduction of housing, which is, all the more reason why new construction is going to be a huge part of our housing market moving forward. And this is just showing you a little bit about that new construction is still representing a pretty significant share of home sales overall. So 12% in 2020. And, despite the huge record increase in home sales in 2020, you saw that the construction industry was able to, maintain the levels that they had been doing in the previous year. So they also ramped up production in 2020. But with that being said, employment growth really is outpacing new construction. So you can see here that single family permits were up 11.9%, but employment growth was up 18.9%. And, it's important to note too that in 2020, we saw a lot of different announcements that new companies moving to Knoxville, and we're adding jobs rapidly. And so this data is based on 2019. So it does not show us what 2020 looked like per se. And so, that this has probably been exacerbated in 2020. And, we'll be interested to hear, Doug and the Chamber's thoughts on that as well. But I think it's important to also note that these data points don't necessarily account for all of the employment growth, and thus, new demand in the housing market. Because, so for example, from 2011 to 2019, Morristown added an average of 600 new jobs annually, but their building permits increased by only 30 per year. And so, the realtor, the National Association of Realtors actually named Morristown as one of the most underbuilt housing markets in the United States. And so how that impacts us in the Knoxville metro area and in the Knoxville area as well is that, we're seeing a lot of job growth in the surrounding area and in East Tennessee more broadly that, is creating more demand in Knoxville as well. And so I would say that these numbers probably don't capture everything, and it's probably a bit more pronounced than what is reflected in those numbers. A little bit of demographic trends. The population in the Knoxville metro area and Knox County are both projected to grow pretty significantly in 2020 or by 2025, but rather. But we did see an influx of new residents in 2020 above and beyond what was projected. We've seen for a number of years that people around the country are moving out of some of the larger metro areas on the coasts and moving to middle America and more affordable metro areas. And that trend was really just exacerbated by the pandemic. And as a result, Knoxville's been seeing a greater share of out-of-state buyers and people who are new to Knoxville, which further constrains our housing supply. And we're likely to see housing demand rise because of this, and especially for homes priced under around 250,000. And that's precisely where we have the least amount of inventory. So to sort of expand on the 2020 migration patterns, Knoxville ranked number 10 on Redfin's list of metro areas with the largest inflow of new residents in 2020. Tennessee was number 1 on U-Haul's list of annual destination states. And the U-Haul also had a list for counties, and 3 of the top 5 counties that saw the most net gain in residents were in East Tennessee. And so that is something that is particularly interesting in Knoxville. When you look across the country, a lot of metro areas are losing population. Knoxville is not. We are gaining population, but in the metro areas that are gaining population, a lot of them are gaining population slowly, but naturally through, new births and deaths. So that's where that net gain is coming from. But in Knoxville in particular, we're seeing a large increase in domestic migration. So people coming to Knoxville from other parts of the country. And that's really not the norm across the United States right now, and really positions Knoxville well as a growing city. But all the more reason why housing is such an important issue right now. This graph is just showing you some trends pre-pandemic that we were already seeing more out-of-state home buyers in the Knoxville area. I am really excited to see what this data looks like in 2020, and I'm believe that it could potentially go over 20% of the share of home buyers that are coming from a different state. But you can see this was a trend that predates the pandemic and is something that has really just increased because of the pandemic. This is also just an interesting little nugget that I like to give people. I often hear people talking about cash buyers, and that there are people coming from all over the country, and they're armed with cash and they are taking over the Knoxville housing market. That's not true. At least that's not what the data says. The data actually says that a fewer share of all home sales were with cash financing in the previous year. And so I like to sort of bust that myth because I think it's interesting. But the nature of this housing market, because there are so few homes on the market, you're more likely to encounter a cash buyer, but there aren't more cash buyers and they aren't taking over the housing market, like a lot of people like to say. So like to include that in these presentations. Some home ownership trends. Homeowners have seen huge equity gains in the last 5 years, and that's likely to continue. Um, we've already covered that, estate home buyers, but another trend that I like to note is that the Black home ownership rate in Knoxville is actually lower than the state and national average. And there is a white-Black home ownership gap of 35 points. And really that is a stark number, and something that I will touch on in a few slides from now, but is really concerning to the realtors, and I think it should be concerning to the broader business community in our local government, really in anyone who's aware of these disparities. But despite this, we are seeing a larger share of Black home buyers in Knoxville. So that is one sort of, it's not really that growing quickly, but it is rising. And that's something that, I'm glad to see, but is definitely concerning. And as we move forward, we should expect more households opting to rent. And I think you see that in the housing construction trends. You see that, new multifamily construction is at the highest level that it's been in 2 decades. And that's in part due to home prices, and we're pricing out because of these huge price appreciation. A lot of people will be priced out of the market, and so we should be prepared to see more people opting to rent. This graph is just going to show you some numbers. So basically, it's looking about, if you bought a house how many years ago, what would your average equity gains be? And so you can see, if you purchased a median price home 30 years ago in the Knoxville metro area, you've seen on average $240,000 in equity gains. And you've seen almost, if you purchased one 5 years ago, you've seen almost or more than 100,000 in equity gains, and 9.6% annual price growth, which is much, much higher than the national average. The national average is around 5% there. But even if you purchased a home 1 year ago, you've seen on average $40,000 in equity gains. So, there are huge financial and economic benefits to home ownership. And Knoxville in particular is a great place to invest in a home, and will continue to be that way for the foreseeable future. And so I want to sort of dive into exactly what the inventory and affordability crisis is. So, price increase, the interesting part of this market, and as you can see on this slide, a monthly mortgage payment in Knox County on the same home today versus 1 year ago is actually more affordable. So the same house, even at its new price, which is on average, 10% more than it was last year, the monthly mortgage payment is still more affordable. So mortgage rates have really offset higher home prices over the past year. But the really huge inventory and affordability concern lies within the distribution of what the housing stock and the price distribution of our supply is in the first place. So the market below 200,000 has the lowest supply, but the highest demand. And you sort of have to tease out what is the affordability problem that is occurring on behalf of rising home prices, and what's the affordability problem of we're not building enough homes at lower price points. And that in the Knoxville area is our largest problem right now, is we don't have the housing stock at the lower price points. And that's really not a result of price appreciation so much as it is, what has been feasible for home builders to build, and rising development costs, and in 2020, rising building material costs, a labor shortage that spans a decade, and I'm sure we'll talk about that in the panel later on. But it's important to sort of recognize that the affordability problem really does center around what we're building and how we're building it and where we're building it. And so this will sort of show you exactly, how this trend has flipped. And so this is going to sort of segment new construction sales by entry-level homes, so homes that would be affordable to the first-time home buyer, and then move-up homes, which are basically homes that are custom homes that are targeted towards existing homeowners who want to move up from their current home. And you've seen that new construction has really centered, and it's really flipped in 2013. A majority were entry-level homes. And by 2019, we saw that 75% were move-up homes, and that we were only about 25% of new construction sales were entry-level homes. And I think this is a structural problem. Home builders didn't just decide one day that they weren't going to build entry-level homes. Because of rising land costs and development costs, it hasn't been financially feasible. And there's a lot of factors at play, like land use regulations, and different development processes that regulations have made, extended the time frame, and things like that are rising costs, and it's not financially viable to build entry-level homes. And so that's a problem that we really need to work to support and incentivize, and make building more entry-level homes financially viable. And so back on the home ownership rate, you can see this home ownership rate, really the disparities exist across minority groups. So the Black home ownership rate is lower than the state and national average, and that's true of the Asian and Hispanic home ownership rate, which is really not a great thing to hear about our city, and something that we need to address. And there was a recent report from Morgan Stanley that was talking about this, that the idea of, yes, fair housing and minority homeownership is on one hand a moral concern and something we should care about regardless. But promoting fair housing and minority homeownership is also an economic development strategy. Minorities sharing in the benefits and the financial prosperity of homeownership, and them being barred from that, is taking an economic toll on our region and on our country more broadly as well. But it is something that we are all better off if we can address these disparities, and is reframing the conversation that way, I think, will be important. And there's a lot of issues that the Realtors are working on the all levels to sort of address this issue, and it's something that I think definitely needs to be talked about more frequently. But you can see we are seeing some increases in the share of Black home buyers in the Knoxville metro area. I do want to caution on this. I did not include the margin of error, and so the public use micro data sample from the ACS Census Bureau data is the sample size isn't super large, and so these are not super reliable, but it is fair to say that there's been a modest increase in the share of Black home buyers, but it's still not an increase that would even come close to addressing the existing disparities. And so looking forward, I love to make this case, and I think it's important, but this is not a housing bubble. this is lack of supply. And there's a number of reasons for that. Unlike in 2008, lending standards are really, really high. And loans are, predominantly going to people who are very well qualified with high credit scores and large down payments. Loans are going to people and people are buying homes that they can afford. And that was not the case in 2008. Another piece of this is that, price gains and this rapid price appreciation really is not, there's really no signs of speculation at this point. This is really just a feature of supply and demand and intrinsic value, as economists would call it. There are fewer homes available, which is inevitably going to drive up home prices. And so, I don't think that we should worry. There isn't widespread speculation, and I did put yet in there because that is still could be an issue, but there's no signs of that being an issue thus far. And so, and a housing bubble is somewhat of a self-fulfilling prophecy. So, it's important to be measured in what we're saying about the market. But, so far there's not a lot of sign that that's the case. And then lastly, home prices really just aren't in a risk of decline. Favorable demographics and population growth is going to bring more homeowner or potential homeowners into the market. Personal income this year is a really weird recession and a weird pandemic year because GDP declined, but personal income was higher than it had been in the previous year. And so there's not a lot of reason that there would be a huge fall in demand or a demand side shock. And likewise, there's not a lot of reason to think that there would be a supply side shock. There's a lot of constraints on home builders, constraints that we need to address, but it's not like there's going to be a huge influx of new construction flooding the market and causing prices to decline. So, that's my perspective. I'm happy to entertain other perspectives, but I don't think that there's a lot of reason to worry about a housing bubble. And I do also want to note that long-term, if you're a long-term home buyer, you really have nothing to worry about. And to sort of expand on that, if you purchased a home during the 2008 crisis, and still own that home today, you've seen large equity gains. Really where you're in trouble is if you are purchasing a home and you plan to sell within a year or 2 years. So that's where the risk is. And lastly, prices are likely to remain high in 2020 and rising, but not as quickly as they did in 2020. Like I said earlier, long-term home buyers are in the best position. And low inventory, as we're already starting to see, could really temper home sales in Q3 and 4 of 2020. We just don't have the supply to continue selling the volume that we are right now. And the last point I want to make is, and I'm sure we'll expand on this, meeting the rising demand for housing is absolutely critical for Knoxville. One, to remain affordable and continue. We brand ourselves as an affordable place to live in a smaller metro with big metro amenities. And so, meeting demand is huge on that end, but also to continue attracting new talent and investment from new companies and different investment around the country. We need to be able to house our workforce, and that's critical, for a number of reasons. So that's what I have for you this morning. And I am looking forward to the panel discussion and talking more about, what specific issues that different stakeholders are facing and how we might be able to address those. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen so we can get the panel started.
Thanks, Hancen. That was really insightful and definitely something that us non-realtors, try to talk about with some level of knowledge. So it's nice to have some expertise to kind of give us some really specific insight on the topic related to housing. So we're going to go ahead and move into the panel. Of course, we're going to have Hancen on here. Then we're also going to have Doug Lawyer, Vice President of Economic Development at the Knoxville Chamber, and John Cook, the President of the Home Builders Association of Greater Knoxville. So let's go ahead and start with the first topic. The first thing I'd like for us to talk about is the key relationship between housing and workforce development and economic growth. And that could be skilled and unskilled labor shortages, and need to have to house our workforce. So John, we'd love for you to kind of go first on this topic, and just kind of provide an overview of your perspective as it relates to workforce development, economic growth, and housing and the housing shortage.
Sure, Caleb. Thank you for having me. I'll touch on a few things that Hancen hit on in his presentation as it relates to what we have as a workforce as far as to build these homes. Hancen talked a lot about the home builder's ability to put homes on the ground is not pacing with the number of homes that we need to. And a lot of that relates to our ability to get the workforce necessary to do that. If you step back to 2008, when the housing market was sort of decimated, there's a lot of folks that left the home building industry. So many folks retired. That was a good time for them to retire and pull out of the home building industry, or they went into another industry because, frankly, we were hit pretty hard. So that did not help us at all. The last many years, our schools have gone away from doing anything to do with trades whatsoever, and so there's not a lot of trade training in high schools whatsoever, or even giving them that option. So having folks come out of trades and being interested in trades, that number is super low to replace the folks that we lost. There are some construction tracks in universities and colleges, but most of those construction tracks are geared towards commercial construction. Very few construction tracks in any university or college are geared towards residential construction, and the two are pretty dissimilar. They sound similar because they have construction in them, but they're pretty dissimilar when it comes down to the end of the conversation. And then market size is another thing that restricts our ability to get the workforce that we need. Knoxville is not a large market. We have one big public home builder here. We have another large public home builder, one of the top 10 builders, that is looking to bring an operation here, and they would be a first-time home buyer operation. But I'm not sure how far along they are, but I do know that they're interested in moving to our market. But because it's a relatively small market, it's hard to draw the number of trades we need here, because they end up staying in markets like Nashville, like Atlanta. Some of these larger markets that aren't that far from here, there's so much work there, and the companies are just, the companies are larger and somewhat more structured. They end up staying in those markets, and it really makes it hard to attract. Unless you're doing a large volume homes, it makes it hard to attract those folks to come here. If they do come here, we have some trades that come out of Nashville, but they literally will come over here for a week, and they will be here just during the week to do whatever it is that they need to do, and then they go back to Nashville. I mean, they live in Nashville or they live in Atlanta, so they travel here, stay in hotels for a week, and then they go back home, on the weekends. So, well, that's one of the big constricting things for us is how do we get the people that we need both in the trades and then also on the more administrative side, how do we get those folks here? As home builders, we feel a little, and developers, we feel a little bit constrained because we can't figure out a good way to get to wrap our hands around how to get all the folks that we need to get here to build homes. How do we affect the education track and get more folks interested in the trades? Because if we can get them interested in the trades, I mean, almost every trade that I have, and I would say most home builders have, is hiring right now. I'm talking everything from plumbers to HVAC to framers, you name it. Every single one of them is looking for help, and they will train But just getting those folks interested and even considering it right now is really tough.
Absolutely. Yeah, and that's a topic that we're addressing a lot at the Chamber on the economic development side, as far as being able to recruit companies and have the workforce that is required to staff that operation. So I'd like to bounce that topic over to Doug to see, Doug, could you provide some insight on, the workforce demand and how Knoxville is impacted, as we continue to recruit companies to the region?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, Hancen, great presentation. Thanks for letting me be a part of this panel discussion. And John hit on a lot of different topics there. And from an economic development angle, it used to be companies would, when they were making major site location or existing businesses and expansion decisions, where do we expand or where do we locate? It was largely, site driven, or we need to be near a port, or we need to be on a rail line. And that has really shifted over the past several years to, we're going to locate our company where the talent is. And talent is driving every conversation with every project that we're seeing from an economic development perspective. And the Chamber has really tried to roll up our sleeves and drill down into this. We did a talent assessment survey several months ago and got a lot of input from around the marketplace here. Like, what are your workforce needs today? What are they 3, 5, 10 years out? What are those going to look like? We have major shortages in talent, in healthcare, in nursing. We have shortages in construction and all the trades, plumbing, welding, HVAC, industrial maintenance. And we're starting to see some of our training providers respond to that. A great example is, in the peak of the pandemic a few months ago, TCAT, the Tennessee College of Applied Technology here in Knoxville, launched some fast path training programs specifically geared towards the trades and welding and HVAC and plumbing. And so can't stress enough how important that is from a growth standpoint. It's not a construction industry problem. It's not a real estate problem. It's a community problem. It's something that we all need to be thinking about and leaning into together. Career awareness of all of these positions has got to start in the middle schools, or maybe even earlier. Students need to understand, what are the career opportunities here in Knoxville? What are these companies that are near my school? What are they doing? We over the years have brought teachers into area businesses and guidance counselors and high school principals and educating them about what we're seeing from an economic development pipeline standpoint. So y'all, our activity is as robust as I've seen it during my career. And I've been doing this a long time in Knoxville and economic development. And, we've got in the past, since the first of the year, we've announced 1,500 new jobs just in Knox County. We've got easily another 500 kind of in the back pocket that are working towards announcement. You probably saw in the news today, Elo Touch, a great existing business that started here, is expanding their R&D and distribution and production facility in Hardin Valley. There's another 50, 90 jobs coming on the market. So they keep coming. So there's a lot of things we can do. I would encourage you, if you haven't, go on the Chamber's website and go under regional enhancement and look at the workforce redefined strategy. So you guys can understand, when you're talking to your clients and your peers, you can understand what, as a community, the Chamber is working on as it relates to this really important topic of workforce development.
Thanks, Doug. And that kind of leans into this other area of middle class and middle income housing. There's definitely a shortage in what John was talking about in the trades and the demand for that type of workforce. There's just a shortage of the housing available for those folks that come to Knoxville to work in one of these industries. And I'd love if you could go ahead and continue to speak to that that middle income housing shortage and the kind of jobs that we're seeing growth in, as far as the companies that we've seen located in Knoxville or the expansions that we've seen. what types of skill sets are you hearing about that are being requested by these employers coming into Knoxville and saying, hey, we'd like to staff up this new location and start hiring pretty quickly? Is there a strategy or an area that you would want to touch on specifically with this group?
Yeah, I mean, the skill sets that are being requested are really across the board. I mean, we've got a lot of entry level skills. You know, you think about what's happening at East Town Mall with Amazon. I mean, those are going to be entry level skills. And then, you know, right across the river in Blount County, you know, there's another Amazon facility. So between those two, that's probably 1,500 kind of entry level, hit the gate kind of positions. We are seeing a lot of interest in information technology, in cybersecurity, and data analytics. CGI is a company that announced back in February, and they're going to hire 300 folks in the IT sector. Great wages, almost $70,000 average wages. So that's a different kind of market from a housing standpoint than the folks that may go work at one of the Amazon fulfillment centers. Customer service facilities, you know, LSI announced earlier this week another 265 jobs coming into an existing office space on Weisgarber. Those are entry level, but they're going to scale up those folks pretty quickly through their internal training academies and get them over $17 an hour fairly quickly with their financial services customer service facility for credit unions nationwide. So it's a big mix. And then, you know, on the manufacturing, which right now probably 60 to 65% of our project pipeline from existing businesses expanding or business attraction projects are in that manufacturing sector. Now we're starting to see more office R&D, techie, cybersecurity type projects, data centers. That number's growing, but manufacturing is still a big chunk of that, and that's going to require industrial maintenance, welding, CNC machining, pneumatics, those types of skill sets.
Yeah, and you know, a lot of the projects that you and I have been working on, you mentioned this is in the IT space, and the project that we announced on Monday, LSI, is actually an office space, a central office space for training that folks are going to be in the office for a few months and then are going to be sent home to work from home. So Hancen, I'd love for you to kind of address that topic on work from home and what sort of demand has been brought up as a result of people not being in the office as frequently, or companies kind of shifting their you know, the way that they occupy those spaces. Is this something that you feel is going to a trend that's going to continue, or do you feel like eventually folks are going to get back to the office and not need to have a home office to work in these areas?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. It's an interesting one, and it's actually talking about this yesterday. You know, I think we will see some level of shift towards you know, permanent work from home. I personally don't think that will be as pronounced in Knoxville as far as existing Knoxville. But I think, you know, will definitely be something that, you know, in the tech industry and in Silicon Valley and people who were living in some of the larger metro areas for big companies will permanently move to work from home. And then, you know, we're going to see that demand in Knoxville because people want to live here because they, you know, make a New York salary and can, you know, afford a home in Knoxville. So, you know, on one hand, I think that is definitely going to be a trait that continues. How much it continues for existing businesses in Knoxville, I'm not so confident about. But I mean, in all of the, you know, we've done a lot of surveys, and the National Association have done a lot of surveys, and it is clear that people want outdoor space in a home office. That is a demand that, you know, even if people aren't working from home, I think they're still going to want that space because, you know, I think people found value in it, and in the pandemic. And so it's something that, once you have, you might not want to get rid of, but it sort of begs the question of, and to sort of talk a little bit about what Doug's saying as well is, we're adding a lot of new jobs at, some of the mid-tier income levels where it is precisely where we don't have the inventory of housing. And, there's how we address that, I think is a huge concern because, we're running out of space in the city of Knoxville and in Knox County. And then, we're moving outward. And so I think there's a lot of conversations in addition to, I think this is a huge workforce, labor shortage problem, but also, talking about what sort of regulations and incentives encourage, building not necessarily straight up, but being innovative about the types of homes, missing middle, duplexes, things that are still conform to what a neighborhood would look like, but also, being able to build outward as well. And, there's a lot of, and I think we're going to touch on the utility issue, infrastructure issue that I think is I hear all the time from developers and home builders. But so, I think it's definitely an issue. And I think, we're going to continue to see more demand for affordable housing, but also housing with offices and outdoor space.
Yeah, absolutely. And John, I'd love for you to talk about that. I've always heard the rumor and over the last few years that it's cheaper to build than to buy. And I've heard recently that that's really not the case anymore. And for the folks that are looking to build and work from home and have a home office, do you feel like that's a trend that you're seeing more or less of, as far as people coming and wanting to build a house before they decide to go out and look at the market in Knoxville?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of folks that are coming into our market and they aren't even considering existing homes. There's so few existing homes for sale. It almost drives them automatically to start looking to build almost right out of the gate. I personally live in Alcoa. I don't think there's a single home on the market in Alcoa right now. So if somebody coming in and wants to relocate to Alcoa, they're going to work at that, at the Amazon or any place else, any of the other expansions are going out. Oh, they have to build, or they an apartment, if that's what they wish to do. So yes, I definitely think the trend right now is toward just going ahead and building because there's very little on the market to buy, and that stuff has, as Hancen pointed out in his presentation, existing homes have appreciated so much. When you start looking at the items in the home that have depreciated, like and are going to need replaced eventually, such as roof, appliances, all those things that are eventually going to need replaced, and look at the lifespan of those items, then it starts making more sense to spend a little bit more money and get a brand new home.
Definitely. Hancen, what's your perspective on the cost of building and buying land to build on? Is there a trend that you see is going to either continue to shoot the price of lumber up and up, or is that going to eventually come back down and make it more affordable for people to build homes and buy property to build their future homes on?
Well, that's a great question. And I think John would have a good perspective as well. But I think there's a pretty consistent consensus among many economists in the real estate industry that most of these, building material price increases are going to be a new normal for at least, a number of years. It's not like this is going to end anytime soon. So, I think we're going to continue to see rising building costs, and we're also going to see rising home costs, and they're rising really, quite frankly, at a similar rate. And so, I think that's a new normal. John, I don't know if you want to hop on to that, but I've not seen much reason to suspect that prices will fall anytime soon on that.
I would agree with that. I mean, there's just nothing pointing in that direction. There's an article that comes out almost every week in some major publication with good data backing it up that points to that not being the case. And that's something that that we have to, everyone is always saying, well, buyers coming in, they're kind of wondering, okay, are we at the top, or are things that, I'm going to wait, I'm going to wait till things get cheaper. And, you'll have people that'll wait 6 months or a year, and they come back to us, and all of a sudden that house went up, 10, 15, 20%. And I just don't see it going down anytime soon. Read a big article this morning about the lumber market and what it's doing. And it's not going down anytime soon. And we're receiving price increases regularly on nearly everything that we buy. It's just simply supply and demand, and there's no forecast for demand to wane. So there's, we're going to continue to see increasing prices, not only in the sticks and bricks. We're going to see some on the labor side as well. And then on the development side, the cost of land that is developable, and then all of the infrastructure, roads, et cetera, that have to be, put into to develop it, to even build. That the cost of that has gone up incrementally too, and that wasn't necessarily covered, but that is something that developers know very well, how much that has gone up just in the last 5 to 7 years. It's incredible how much every linear foot of street, how much that has gone up versus what it was, 4, 5, 7 years ago in our market. That adds dramatically to the cost to build a home.
Well, and I'll add to that as well. I mean, I think that you make a great point. And I think that that's an issue broadly, and particularly now that we're having this infrastructure conversation nationally, but we're going to have to find ways to, I mean, when developers and home builders are footing the cost for infrastructure in developments, that it contributes to the price of homes. And so, if we are, we need to find creative ways to take some of these costs off of home builders and developers, and recognize that housing is an investment in our community, and reaps rewards. I know the real estate industry in Tennessee accounted for about 17% of Tennessee's GDP, and each home sale, new and existing, made an economic impact of about $75,000. And so, finding ways to take costs from the back end out of homes, like, investing in infrastructure locally, and using funds that we get from the federal government to do that, I think it's just another, and, decreasing the time that it takes to develop a lot, and some of those regulations to help spur housing supply is the one thing that we really can have. The ball is in our court to lower prices in that respect.
Definitely. Well, we're getting close to the end of our time, and I want to give everybody an opportunity to ask questions before the end of the panel. If you all, we probably have time for 1 or 2 different questions. Ginger, would you like to go through and pull out one of the questions that were not covered in this discussion?
Absolutely. Let's see. Here was a question for John, asking, how are you handling pricing on new construction when negotiating the price of a home?
So there are 2 tracks of thought with respect to that, or probably 3 that are going on in the home building industry right now. You have some builders are not taking any contracts right now on a home that's under construction. So they're waiting until the home is built, putting a price on it, and then selling it, because they do not know how much that house is going to end up costing them. And let's face it, home building is not a high margin business, so the margins get eroded pretty quickly. That is happening quite a bit, especially by some of your larger, more national type builders. They're just putting homes on the ground, and then they'll sell them when they're completed, so they know exactly what they had in them. Some of these smaller and your more local builders, are going to have price escalation clauses in their contracts. So if they sign a contract, they're going to have a price escalation clause that could give them an ability to track with the market. So contract price is X, and if the market cost of, and they're going to track indices, probably lumber and some other indices, and they'll do it that way. And then third option is basically to do the best that you can based on what your numbers are and what you forecast, and lock a price in. That makes buyers more comfortable. It's harder to do, but it's still locking a price right now for what you're going to pay for those, those materials later on. But it's challenging because it's hard to know. A lot of builders are sold out 3-6 months, some of them 9 months or more. So you're not going to start a home for 3, 6, 9 months, and that home takes 6 months to build. It's hard to know what those materials you're going to buy 15, 16 months from now are going to be. But that's kind of the 3 ways that builders are doing it. We're taking option 3, but that doesn't mean it's necessarily the right option for everyone.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for just being willing to speak to this group of people. We had a pretty large turnout today, and Hancen, I know there was a lot of questions about whether or not you'd be able to share the slides. If that's a possibility, go ahead and send that over to Ginger so she can distribute it to this group. But thank you all so much for being here today to cover these topics that are pretty pertinent to every single person in this discussion. And we look forward to having you on the next event. And feel free to reach out to myself or Ginger if you have any additional questions you'd want to relay over to John, Hancen, or Doug. Have a great day, everyone.
Yeah, have a good one.